Ah, look at you, my darling. Look at your eyes, sweet as doves behind the veil that your hair makes as it cascades from your head, like a flock of goats, black ones, bounding down off Mount Gilead. And your teeth, white as the day they were born, or newly shorn and freshly washed, each with its perfect mate. Not one of them is alone. Why should we be? And the lips of your mouth, a ribbon of scarlet. Your temples behind that veil glow like the halves of a freshly sliced pomegranate. Your neck, the grace of the Tower of David, with its jewels hung around it like 1,000 shields of warriors. And your breasts, like the twin fawns of a gazelle hiding among the lilies. All my nights till the sun comes chasing its shadows. Let me play in these perfumed hills, these mountains scented with myrrh. Beauty was named for you, my darling. Your beauty is perfect.
So, given that I am only at Shalom for 10 more days, this seemed like the perfect time to preach on Song of Solomon. But in all fairness, this was not my idea. There was a midweek change in the preaching schedule, and so I consulted the Anabaptist Hot Takes group, which had their last meeting on Wednesday, and asked them for their suggestions about what to preach on. And it was Shelley Weaver Dick who suggested preaching from Song of Solomon. So the good news is, if this gets really awkward, you can just set it aside and not have to think about it and not have to see me for a long time. But if it gets really awkward, I would like you first to invite you to stay in that awkward, to breathe through it, to be curious and think about what you can learn from that awkwardness, from that discomfort. Before we get too much into Song of Solomon, though, I think it is helpful to spend a little bit of time defining what we mean by sexuality. So it will be sex first, and then I will come back around to religion at the end. I think it's helpful to define sexuality. I think we often assume that everybody knows what we're talking about when we say sexuality, that sexuality is self-evidently sex plus some other syllables. But I think it's useful to get a little more specific than sex plus something. And I like the way that sexuality is defined in the Our Whole Lives curriculum, a holistic, all ages sexuality curriculum series compiled by the Unitarian and United Churches of Christ. And they offer that sexuality is the set of experiences, identities, and beliefs that inform and influence our bodies, our relationships, and our sexual health in 5 areas. And they use this image of the circles of sexuality to begin to describe, to offer some context for what we talk about when we mean sexuality. So this idea of sensuality is this attendance to the senses, the awareness, acceptance, enjoyment of one's own and others' bodies. And this is a range, right? Some of this is sexual and some of this may not feel as sexual. That this is everything from skin hunger, the desire for human touch, to the sexual response cycle itself, to the fantasies that we have, to our own concept of our body image. And then this idea of intimacy is the second circle, which is the experience of closeness with each other. Intimacy can be romantic. It can also be very mundane, as those of you who have small children know. Intimacy includes caring and sharing, loving, liking. It's also vulnerability, right? It's what we choose to expose of ourselves, the risks that we take in our relationships, the trust that we have, and the reciprocity between individuals. And then there is sexual identity, which covers these sort of buckets of these different pieces of identity around biological sex, your physical anatomy, your gender identity, the way that you identify as male, as female, as non-binary, as something else. Gender expression, running kind of the spectrum from more masculine to feminine to androgynous kinds of gender expression. The way that you process gender roles and the way that you process sexual orientation, all of this is wrapped up in how we perceive ourselves as beings. And then this piece of sexual health and reproduction, which again includes anatomy, physiology, but also healthcare, physical health, contraceptions, abortion, infections, sex itself, and the range of attitudes, of behaviors, of things that we do to care for ourselves and our sexual health, and the reproductive process. And then this last category, this last circle of sexualization, is defined as the use of sexuality to influence, control, and/or manipulate others. And I think this is actually the weakest part of this framework, because sexualization includes flirting, it includes message, images, media that we engage around sex. And then it also, in this articulation of the circles, includes withholding sex, sexual harassment, rape, assault, incest. And so this contains a lot of the most negative and most abusive pieces of sexuality. And there are some folks who would argue that within sexuality, that does not belong at all. If we're talking about healthy sexuality, that does not include abuse. So they would actually create a sixth circle that is not on the Venn diagram at all, where all of the abusive behaviors would go, and then would articulate sexualization as these more positive aspects of communication, influence, power as it influences sexuality. And then all of these are overlaid on this Venn diagram of what are your values and how do your values inform the ways that you behave in each of these circles. And so this is the framework that I use and that I often find helpful to provide definition or framing for engaging sexuality. And I want to pause there and just give you all a chance to share your thoughts if this brings up anything for you. Not hearing anyone, I will continue on. So this is a time for self-reflection. And so I want to take a moment and invite you to think about some questions about your sexuality, particularly as it relates to the pandemic. So beginning with this circle of intimacy, this circle of sexuality, of intimacy. Intimacy is something that has changed quite a bit for most of us during the pandemic. I can recall that 2 weeks after the lockdown began, a friend and college roommate of mine organized a Zoom party for a circle of friends from our graduating class at Goshen. This party had a dress code, formal, and drinks, bring your own, and some successful and not so successful breakout rooms, as we often felt in the early days of Zoom. But it gathered friends from Salem, Oregon to Princeton, New Jersey, and all across the country and in between. And as I sat on my couch staring at all of the faces in their little boxes, most of whom I hadn't talked to for years, I had a tingling sensation of the intimacy that we shared from all the nights that we spent studying, partying, arguing, finding ourselves, becoming who we were now. And all of the trust that I had when we were all students at Goshen, or classmates, or roommates, or neighbors, or instigators, or explorers, still existed. And that intimacy remained exactly where I'd left it 11 years ago, which I think is part of the magic of Goshen College and of any good college experience. And yet that intimacy surprised me. The pandemic redefined intimacy for many of us, and intimacy shifted and evolved over these months. We became more intimate with the people in our homes, or we didn't, and these other people became more distant in their immediacy. Some of us moved in with family members we hadn't lived with for years. Some had family members move in with us. Distance collapsed into nothing, everyone equally impossible to touch. And we became more intimate friends with friends in other parts of the country or the world. And we became more intimate with our animals. My dog has become more human than ever, and I think I am probably more dog than I have ever been. Over the pandemic, we have moved more and more in the rhythms of people who are used to living with each other, who are used to moving together. My dog reads my cues and my behaviors in ways that I didn't realize I was signaling. And I forget sometimes that this is a kind of intimacy that has shifted with the pandemic. And that as we re-enter, as we reopen, those of us who have animals have a greater intimacy likely with them. And so I want to offer you some reflections as you think about the pandemic and your experience of intimacy. What have been your most intimate spaces during the pandemic? Do you feel greater intimacy with yourself? Do you feel greater intimacy with members of your household, or your pets, or even the wild animals that are in your proximity? Have you grown more intimate with people in geographically distant places? Have stress or depression or anxiety hindered your ability to experience intimacy? Who were you most intimate and vulnerable with a year ago? Who are you most intimate and vulnerable with now? Who do you want to cultivate more intimacy with in the coming year? Who are you willing or ready to become less intimate with? And the second circle of sensuality. Sensuality is a bit of a slippery thing to define because it is generally anything that stimulates your senses. And in doing so, that stimulation grounds you more deeply in your body, in what it means to be incarnate, to be in the flesh, to be made in God's image, to be a breath and a soul wrapped in a bucket of skin and nerves and feeling. Many of our sensual activities evaporated overnight in the pandemic. Getting a massage, having your hair styled, even going to the gym, watching a movie on a big screen, getting your nails done, these things that we felt in our bodies that we could no longer engage in. And so the pandemic created a canvas for new kinds of sensuality, new ways to feel in our bodies, inside ourselves. Some people went out and bought Pelotons and home workout equipment. Some people went out and bought sex toys. Some people started making sourdough, sinking their hands into the satiny living dough. And all of this are experiences of sensuality, ways of attending to our senses. And sensuality is culturally contextual. And the pandemic's shifting cultural context took away some of our familiar sensual experiences, but also allowed us to establish new ones. hopefully healthier ones. For some people, it became a time of shutting down senses. And that was a difficult experience. There was one point over the winter where I found myself smelling everything, lighting scented candles, putting spices in all of my food. And I realized that I was trying to create an olfactory landscape that I had not felt in many months. One of the most enlightening things that I learned about sensuality during the pandemic came by way of science. And this is not a very sensual slide at all, but I think this is a helpful diagram and way of thinking about how sensuality impacts us and how we engage it. So my therapist recommended to me a particular YouTube video on polyvagal theory, which is a fancy way of saying how your nerves process feelings of safety and danger. And I realized I had articulated a sense that I was having trouble connecting with my senses. And as I watched this video, I realized I had articulated this at an intellectual task, or at an intellectual level, but what I was experiencing was a physiological challenge, that I was occupying a particular part of my nervous system was more activated in the sympathetic nerves in a more stressed way. And so I was constantly at a low level of danger and threat mentality. And that made it very hard for me to attend to aspects of sensuality, because sensuality requires a certain level of safety, of comfort and normalcy in order to access these senses. So you may have the physical elements that create sensuality, but physiologically, you aren't able to experience them in the same ways. And so that for me helped me process how I did reconnect to sensuality, how I did tap into my senses. It made me more aware of my levels of stress and allowed me to take actions to reorient my body, to acknowledge when I was in a state of alertness, and as trauma therapist Resmaa Menakem says, to settle my body so that I could experience sensuality. So if that stimulates your curiosity, you can look up that video there. But I also want to offer this set of questions around sensuality and your past year and a bit. Did you experience a decline in sensuality and the things that give you pleasure? Did you discover new practices that create pleasure or find time for familiar practices? How have you attended to sensory deprivation? How has it felt to reopen your sensory input? Have you fantasized about different things? Do you fantasize as frequently as you used to? And then we come to this circle of sexual identity. At some point in the pandemic, I realized that it had been months since I had put on a dress, and I love wearing dresses, but my guiding principle had become, particularly through the winter, how close can I get to wearing sweatpants today? And I am someone who needs to match my bottom and my top in Zoom and 3D, so the no pants philosophy did not work for me. But as I opened my closet and looked at my dresses, just repeatedly, day after day, I felt a sense of repulsion of why would I want to wear this? And this is just a tiny way that sexual identity changed over the pandemic, that my gender expression changed. And for some, this time of pandemic, this time with your own thoughts, may have caused you to rethink your own aspects of sexual identity. One friend shared that she felt she was closer to asexual than she'd realized previously. Another friend spent part of her pandemic refining her drag king, a stylized Salvador Dali-inspired character. Another friend said that they thought that they preferred they, them pronouns, but they weren't quite ready to say so publicly. And in recent years, we've had this language, this image developed around sexual identity, defined in this image of the genderbread person. And the genderbread person is a way of helping us think about the different aspects of gender identity. That gender identity both includes your sense of what your gender is, that expression of gender, right? So all of this is a spectrum. You can be a woman who expresses in more masculine ways. You can be a genderqueer person who expresses in feminine ways. And all of that is distinct from your biological sex, from your actual anatomy. And all of that is yet still distinct from your sexual orientation, which is also a spectrum. And I think this is a helpful image. It may be familiar to some of you, it may not be familiar to some of you. Older generations were taught that these were staid and stable categories. But recently we've come to understand that many aspects of sexual identity change with time and are interchangeable. And change not just with time, but with healing, with knowledge of self, and with, of course, cultural context. And it is worthwhile and important to check back on aspects of sexual identity, to not fix ourselves at any points in this, but to allow ourselves to express and to note how our identity changes. And so some questions to reflect on. Did your gender expression change during the pandemic? Did you adopt any practices typically associated with a different gender? Did you discover new dimensions of your own gender identity? Did you discover new dimensions of your sexual orientation? Have you thought differently about gender roles? Have you thought differently about sex drive and sexual identity? And then there is the circle of sexual health and reproduction. I think for all of these categories, the pandemic created a range of experiences, but that range is particularly wide, perhaps the widest, in this category of sexual health and reproduction. For me, as a single woman in a season of good health, there was something really beautiful about the timeless abyss of the pandemic and the spaciousness that it gave to me. That I was able to stop tracking my period entirely and to not be worried about being caught out with the necessary supplies, to not worry about contraception. For another friend with similar factors, it was stressful to feel disconnected from healthcare providers, and she worried about accessing services when she needed them. For those who became pregnant or were already pregnant when the pandemic began, there was a different set of experiences. For those pursuing fertility treatment, yet another experience. For those who were planning for or who had scheduled vasectomies at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a different experience. For those approaching menopause, yet another experience. And for those approaching puberty, something else entirely. For those managing erectile dysfunction, another. And for those treating or managing sexually transmitted infections through the pandemic, yet another experience. All of these changes in sexual health are challenging and emotionally fraught on their own. But the pandemic rattled and reconstructed the ways that we experience these aspects of sexual health and reproduction. So some questions to consider. Did you spend less time thinking about or worrying about pregnancy or contraception? Did you spend more time thinking about or worrying about pregnancy or contraception? Did the cost of your sexual health care go down? Did it go up? Did you have to seek medical care for sexual health or reproduction during the pandemic? Did those in your household have changes in their sexual health or reproduction? Did you notice aging impact your sexual health or reproduction? Where did you feel a sense of relief? Where did you feel a sense of anxiety? Do you have what you need now to feel confident in your sexual health as the world reopens? And then this last circle of sexualization. And as I said earlier, sexualization is the most poorly defined of these 5 categories, and the only one that encompasses both healthy and abusive behaviors. So sexualization is about watching for the red flags that indicate an unsafe situation, but it can also mean watching for how eroticism comes forward in different ways and at different times. Sexualization is about the way that power manifests around these other 4 categories, and that how different power dynamics can become joyful and celebratory, or can become harmful and violent. And that's what I like about this meme, is the way that it plays with power and perception and sexuality. Right? It is funny to think about the different ways that lesbians are perceived. And if you think about this a little more, it's concerning. This image of Westboro Baptist thinks I do is funny in one context. But if you think of that as 1/6 of the world perceives me that way, that's terrifying. But the power in this meme is that the I, whoever this meme creator is, ultimately gets to define herself. She gets to live in this world of what I think I do and what I actually do. And if she wishes to occasionally dip into the other images when it makes her happier and healthier and more attuned to the world. The pandemic necessarily shifted power dynamics around relationships by confining and separating and revealing new truths. For some, that was healthy. For others, it heightened existing abuse. Some questions to consider. Have the power dynamics around your sexual relationships changed? How do you feel about these changes? Are you comfortable with flirting? Have your boundaries, expectations, skill, or comfort around flirting changed? Did you experience abuse during the pandemic? Did the pandemic cause you to reflect more or differently about past abuse? Are you using porn in different ways than you used to? Are you using porn in ways that have negative impacts on your sexual interactions with your partner? Do you have difficulty orgasming without porn? And finally, these 5 circles exist, but again, they are informed by our values. And as our values have shifted during the pandemic, or as the pandemic has clarified what we value, these circles might adjust, or our perception, our engagement in each of these circles might adjust based on what we know about ourselves now, how we articulate our values now. And so are there accommodations that you make? Are there shifts that you need to make because of the ways that your values have changed during the pandemic? And this brings us back to the scripture and to Song of Solomon in particular. Someone asked me this week, why is Song of Solomon even in the Bible? And I think it is helpful to remember that the Bible is an anthropocentric book. For all that we take it as a book about God, it is a book that centers human experience. And human experience includes sexuality. So Song of Solomon might seem like an outlier in the biblical text, but it is also a refreshing and valuable counterpoint. Much of the sex that happens in the Bible is patriarchal, procreative, and at times coercive or layered with abuse. And Song of Solomon envisions a healthy relationship of a sexually active, mutually respecting, joyful, biracial, or dark-skinned couple. We know that the woman has dark skin. We don't get to hear as much about the complexion of the man. But what we hear in this is a healthy and joyful relationship. And how beautiful is it to know that God loves us so much, that God went out of the way to nudge and influence and warm the hearts of the bishops long ago making decisions about what got included in the Bible, and made sure that it wasn't all hopeless heterosexual relationships, that there are also beautiful, warm, and intimate sexual relationships that are part of the Bible. As I've said already many times, sexuality is contextual. If what you know is goats running down the side of a mountain, you'll describe your lover in those terms. If what you know is eggplant emoji, you'll describe your lover in those terms. Sexuality is contextual and it changes over time. And it changes in the 1,000 years since Song of Solomon was written. It changes in the span of our own lives. But the Bible is a book of visions. It is a book that weaves a vision of thriving, healthy world in right relationship as God intended it. And so just as Revelation is a vision of renewed Eden, Song of Solomon is a vision of right sexual relationships. We may not get there fully in this life, but we hold and treasure and hope this vision. We write it on our hearts and speak it out loud. This is a gift within our sacred texts to give us some framing, some blueprint to begin building the vision that we want to hold, that honors God and honors creation. It behooves us to attend to and be intentional with our sexuality. It behooves us in the midst of going about our business to be interrupted with images of sensuality and joy and to be recalled to what we want and value. Our media and myths around sexuality often tell us that sexuality just happens, that you make eye contact with someone and then you kiss them. You just light a candle and then your marriage becomes erotic again. You're just attracted to who and what you're attracted to, and it all just unfolds like a movie reel. And there are some aspects of sexuality that just happen, and you can live your life that way. But because sexuality is contextual and is culturally constructed, what that means is that your sexuality, if you are not intentional about it, will end up looking like the cultural messages that you receive about it. If you receive messages that porn is an essential part of masculinity, you will consume more porn. If you receive messages that femininity is about purity, you will have greater anxiety that sex might make you impure. At the end of the day, sexuality doesn't just happen. We can adjust our habits, recalibrate when old patterns stop working for us. We can shift our perception of identity or sensuality or intimacy. And it is hard work to adjust the familiar patterns, particularly in sexuality, because these are patterns within our body, right? There is some degree of muscle memory to this. There is some degree of gravitation toward the familiarity, which is hard to reconstruct in our neural systems, in our physical movements, in our nerves. But we can change and tool and reconstruct and adjust elements of our sexuality with intentionality. If you begin to put on perfume before sexual interactions, smelling that perfume will become sexy. If you feed the dog before every sexual interaction, feeding the dog becomes sexy, right? Because everything is culturally contextual. And our habits form us. And in that way, we have the power to create our context. And it behooves us to be intentional about building that context, right? We may have these habits that we don't even realize are part of our rhythms, but that are informing and shaping our sexuality. Sexuality benefits from intentionality, visioning, aspiration. And this is the other reason that Song of Solomon is in the Bible. Because sexuality doesn't just happen. It is nurtured. These two voices of these two lovers playing with fantasy and metaphor and desire and language. They say and write all these things partly because they want to have better sex. They have better sex because they spent 9 or 11 chapters describing their relationship to us in Song of Solomon. They have a better relationship because they can flirt with each other. They are communicating with each other. They are expressing desire. They are clear about what they want. And we heard the scripture twice this morning. I asked Shelley and Javen each to read it because we hear it differently depending on context. If it catches you by surprise, it can elicit giggles and awkwardness. And if we hear it in the context of a Sunday morning collective intergenerational conversation on what it means to do justice, love mercy, walk humbly, treat other humans with dignity as if they are made in the image of God, to treat ourselves as if we are made in the image of God, it might still be giggly and awkward, but we might see something else in it too. Something that points us to healing and hope, to reconciliation and renewal, to the liberated, liberating human that God calls you to be.
Move in our midst, thou Spirit of God. Go with us down from thy holy hill. Walk with us through the storm and the calm. Spirit of God, go thou with us still.
Touch thou our hands to lead us aright. Guide us forever, show us thy way. Transform our darkness into thy light. Spirit of God, lead thou us today. Strike from our feet the fetters that bind. Lift from our lives the weight of our own. Teach us to love with heart, soul, and mind. Spirit of God, thy love makes us strong and kindle our hearts to burn with thy flame. Raise up thy banners high in this hour and stir